We're good to go. Give it up for Robert.
You introduced me a little late, you know.
Good, we have a microphone. Let's bring it up.
So, unfortunately, the reason for my delay tonight is that there's a gaping hole in the middle of my PowerPoint presentation. But to compensate, you all will get to see a showcase of my impressive improvisational abilities. I really enjoyed talking yesterday. So, James asked me before we begin to explain why evidence is so important for the Christian faith. And it's a very, perhaps unnecessarily murky issue because faith is an often maligned word for perhaps the wrong reasons. The process of, I've defined it here as the process of continuing to accept something even when it's no longer convenient. Sometimes if we were talking about religious faith, we suddenly decide we want another definition, especially if we're polemicists. So, the reasons I've provided for this are that many religious beliefs are in fact philosophical propositions, or they're not really open to external scrutiny. And there's a fairly obvious criticism of this, and that's that if they're not really testable, they're analysed on fairly subjective criteria. And that in turn means that they are preference-based, which in turn exposes us to cheap rhetoric about going one God further in similar arguments. This is important. It's important that Christianity behaves differently because if it's falsifiable, then we're dealing with something that's relatively open for scrutiny. We can have a more systematic approach for why we believe or do not believe. It's overall more accessible. So for this reason, I was chosen to present on the historicity of the New Testament text. So I'm going to get that obviously much. So good reason why we've chosen historicity is that it's a good example of how Christianity and only Christianity can be tested as a truth claim. The bad reason is that a lot of popular scholarship on New Testament historicity is simply appalling. To put it bluntly, the arguments are shallow, poorly researched. If they're not based on outdated scholarship, they are often based on myth. So the purpose of this presentation is to establish a basic foundation for testing the claims unique to Christianity. We're not actually going to prove or try to prove it's true. That's James's. So we're just going to lay some groundwork. I haven't bothered to justify this. We'll get to that later.
Can we increase the size of the screen?
Start the slideshow button. Actually make a presentation.
Yeah. Exactly.
Good. So, the Gospels, contemporary scholars tend to accept the following dates. And you need to see the first of many gaping holes in my presentation, because I have not provided a date for acts. Again, if scholars present dates that deviate from these, it's generally because they're offering earlier rather than later dates. And that's not necessarily because they're hardcore biblicalists who are attempting to prove the reliability of the New Testament, although that is often the case. So a prominent example is J.A.T. Robinson. If you're interested, I think the text redating the Gospels, redating the New Testament, is worth reading for further reference. Along with those sources, we use a number of undisputed Pauline sources, a couple that are more commonly disputed, and the pastoral epistles are disputed still more frequently. as well like Hebrews, which is not actually written by Paul, although many people fail to appreciate that. First John and First Peter, which we have no consensus for the authors of, but which are generally accepted to have been written in the 1st century. There are extra biblical sources like the Talmud, from which we can trace some early material. It's quite a murky area, so one has to be cautious. And there are secular sources like Tacitus, at least one passage from Josephus. I suspect I'll get called up on that later. And other sources that incidentally mention Christianity, such as Pliny. And some sources like Suetonius, which are more obscure and ambiguous. So, now that I've rammed that down your throats, we need to explain how it is that we arrive at this sort of conclusion. So we'll use the Gospel of John as an example. Here are a list of, here's some of the evidence available for the early dating of the Gospel of John. This includes things like physical evidence in the case of the Ryland fragment. So these early manuscript fragments are used to establish a sort of minimum date on the Gospels. This is, although these passages these fragments are often used within New Testament scholarship, within popular apologetics, they're in fact of limited use. They're a little ambiguous. There are fairly wide confidence intervals on their dates. So often we rely on references from the early church or occasionally heretical sources. And in that case, this is, in John's case, that's often Polycarp. I mentioned the writing to the Philippians here, but there are several quotes from a series of letters he provided to churches in Turkey, modern Turkey, which contain a large number of references written around the 120s, the 130s, and either paraphrase or quote John. So similarly, the Gnostics were quite fond of John, and we had a number of gospel of quotations from these sources. The result is, and this is where I need to begin improvising, that we have a fairly large number of sources, reasonably early 2nd century, and they're also quite widely geographically distributed. Now, actual arguments for dating the Gospels in a more detailed way than that tend to be very abstract. They deal with the internal features of the text. And they're quite difficult for lay people to access, so I haven't bothered outlining any of them here. The implication of this is fairly obvious, because if the Gospels are written late, then they are far more likely that they include substantial amounts of legendary material. Misconceptions arise. I'm certain that you could consult a polemicist if you wanted to know the details of why that makes them unreliable. This has nothing to do with any of the Gospels. I just put it here because it might turn out to be useful later. It's a collection of all the Pauline epistles, including Hebrews, which is not Pauline, but just like the modern Bible, it's being inserted into the middle of Pauline material. And this represents an early example of canonical sorting, because it displays much of the same quirks we see in modern interpretations of the, we see in a modern arrangement of the epistles. Similarly, we can, once we establish an early date, we can talk reasonably about whether or not there's an early frame, whether or not there's a reasonable chance of authentic authorship. Now, in the case of secular sources such as Tacitus, we normally have to establish independently how we know their authorship comes about. because aside from a few oblique references within the text, it's not exactly clear who the author is. There's a similar situation with John. There are a number of fairly early sources which state that John was in fact the author of the Gospel of John. And those include Papias, who is writing, I think, mid-120s, Polycarp and through Polycarp, Irenaeus, who offer a much later but far more lucid and perhaps coherent account of how the Gospel of John was written. And there are additionally heretical sources like Heraclian, who was writing, if memory serves, southern Italy, 170, 180. Which represents, so what we're generally seeing here is a consensus that the Gospels were written by this specific author. We've got again a reasonable distribution of witnesses claiming this. Oh, let me catch my thoughts. And there's also a fairly low ideological implication to state the authorship of these. Heraclian is a Gnostic, therefore a heretic. Irenaeus, when he cites Polycarp, is not attempting to win any particular ideological battle. Nor is his mention of the authorship embedded in a public document. So he's not attempting to win over outsiders when he mentions his sources here. The implication of this is that authorship is the authorship is reasonably well attested by the standards of ancient history. And we can say more broadly, I think F.F. Bruce stated this, that if the authenticity of, the evidence for the authenticity of the Gospels was applied to any secular document, it would have been established as authentic several times over. We'll keep this split standard in mind for later. Right, good. That's most of the holes filled, so we can start moving faster. Scholarly consensus often results in some surprising conclusions which aren't accepted by the main popular New Testament historicity. So here you'll see some surprising conclusions from E.P. Saunders, an agnostic and New Testament scholar. And it is, I've had to cut it in several sections. It's quite an exhaustive list of things we generally accept about the details of his life. A couple I underline. Firstly, he was executed. And secondly, that the disciples believed that they saw him after his death. These are points that James will return to when he offers his presentation. Again, whilst it's generally not accepted by non-Christians that Jesus believed he was God, they do believe, firstly, that he believed that God's kingdom was coming, and he believed that he would be the eschatological agent of that coming. He had a very high opinion of his own role in God's creation, and it's not necessarily symptomatic of a humble, enlightened moral teacher who is universally well adjusted. Similarly, it's in fact generally accepted that Jesus believed he could perform miracles and convinced others that he could also perform miracles. Again, I would appeal to Saunders here. This is derived not only from Christian sources, but also sections of the Talmud, references from Josephus, which I believe to be authentic. and also by stripping back the layers of the Gospels and trying to find the early sources that were used to produce them. Now, obviously, non-Christians don't accept that what Jesus was doing is supernatural. They explain these as psychosomatic cures or similar. But the fact remains that Jesus, again, does not come across as especially well-adjusted and rational, as many mainstream skeptics would like to think of him as. So, obviously, this is hopefully very different from what is conventionally accepted about the history of Jesus. It's also notable that a lot of this represents actual progress on the subject of New Testament scholarship. People have been obliged to change their minds, most likely based on the evidence, because it is sufficiently strong to allow that. So, wrapping up, obviously none of this actually proves Christianity is true, and specific events within the Gospels might be false or unreliable. I am not an inerrantist. But the Gospels themselves can't be dismissed on historical grounds. We're applying an increased amount of skepticism to them, precisely because they have such wide-ranging implications for metaphysics. So this additional scrutiny is again a result of metaphysical concerns. And it's these debates that New Testament scholars often get caught up in, by which Bruce means theologians here. And it follows, therefore, that it is at least in principle possible to establish a case for Christianity based on the available data.